Philip Alston spent 2 weeks touring the United States last December, but he wasn't hitting the tourist hotspots. Instead, he visited places like Skid Row in Los Angeles, Appalachia and Puerto Rico, places where poverty and homelessness are rampant. He conducted his tour in order to write a report on whether poverty in America undermines human rights here. And he did so under the auspices of the United Nations, where he is the special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. Alston says the Trump administration facilitated his visit. However, the response from the White House since then has been scathing. Last month, Alston published his final report. We'll get to the conclusions in a moment, but first let me read to you what U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley wrote this week in National Review. It is patently ridiculous for the UN to spend its scarce resources studying poverty in the wealthiest country in the world, a country where the vast majority is not in poverty and where public and private sector social safety nets are firmly in place to help those who are. Joining me now is the author of that UN report, Philip Alston. Pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thank you.
So explain first why you decided to take on this assignment and what the objective was.
Well, my role in advising the UN Human Rights Council is to visit a number of countries each year. I most recently went to countries like China and Saudi Arabia, for example. It seemed to me that the United States has a very major influence on issues of policy relating to poverty and human rights, and it was an ideal time to undertake a visit.
And when you went, were you surprised by what you started to discover, or were you already aware of some of the problems? How would you describe your journey?
I knew basically what I was going to find, but the contrasts that one actually comes across in a place like Skid Row in Los Angeles, in Appalachia and so on, in Puerto Rico, of course, the poorest non-state in the Union, those contrasts are really dramatic. And when you consider the statistics, which I think was the really important thing, the starting point for the Trump administration was that it inherited the most unequal society in the West, and it inherited 40 million people living in poverty. But while I was there, it was very busily putting in place policies that seemed to be deliberately designed to exacerbate both of those problems.
And explain, if you will, just the problem even before the Trump administration, that is the kind of the more generic problem in the United States, which, as you say, 40 million people living in poverty. This is unlike any other really rich country in the world. In other words, if you looked at the world's richest countries, the OECD countries, certainly the top half of them, this level and extent of poverty is quite unusual.
The United States is a champion. It comes close to the top on almost all of the bad indicators. So whether it's child poverty, whether it's number of people in prison, whether it's the health outcomes, whether it's healthy life expectancy, the United States does extremely badly. And yet, as Nikki Haley said, it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
And in a sense, what you're highlighting is that contrast, which is despite the fact that it is one of the richest countries in the world, by some measures the richest country in the world, it has these, and it's not just fair to call them pockets, right? These are large pools of extreme poverty.
You've got 40 million Americans living in poverty. That's a very large percentage of the, something like 14% of the population. In most countries that I visit, the justification that's offered is that the government simply can't afford to offer more generous benefits, to provide decent health care, to provide decent education, childcare and so on. They just don't have the money. In the United States, where the Congress was busily finding $1.5 trillion for tax cuts for the wealthy, that clearly is not the explanation. And so what seemed to me was that there is really an ideological push behind this effort to stigmatize the poor, to announce that a lot of the programs are going to be very significantly cut, and effectively that they have to fend for themselves.
Were you surprised by Nikki Haley's response, given that the administration had cooperated with your visit?
Ambassador Haley's response was very strange because, apart from saying that my report was biased and I got all my statistics wrong and so on, but never specifying what those were, she essentially said that the United Nations should focus all of its time on countries like Burundi and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because that's where real human rights violations are taking place. But as she knows, the whole focus of the UN program is on countries like China, Russia, Australia, where I come from, which has major problems with turning away asylum seekers in ways that violate international law. The whole notion of human rights accountability is that it applies to all countries.
Philip Alston, pleasure to have you on, sir. Thank you.